Whatever God has said to you, do. Genesis chapter 31, verse 16. And when Joseph was born, Jacob said to his father-in-law, "Send me away, that I may return into my country, into my land." Thus begins the next stage of Jacob's odyssey. Having come out to the east, young Jacob married, sired children, and labored for years. And now the man Jacob is eager for independence, to separate his branch of the family from that of his uncle Laban and to strike out on his own. As I noted in the last episode, the coming adventure will describe the natural perils of such a breaking away, but the primary drama of Jacob's daring journeys is always found in the personal relationships he has with those around him. As a boy and a young man, the excitement surrounded his interactions with his brother, with his mother, and with his father. Now, in this segment, as he enters midlife, it will be his relationship with his in-laws which will drive the narrative. But before we get into that, please remember to visit my website, western-traditions.org. All of my podcasts can be found there at that website, and there's also a shopping page where you can get some Western Traditions merchandise. And if you wish to support my podcast directly, you can also press the PayPal or Patreon buttons there at the bottom of the homepage. Patreon supporters get behind-the-scenes access to the podcast, and I also post the occasional essay or interesting link for Patreon members. Besides my webpage, you can also find this podcast on Spotify, on YouTube, on Amazon Music, and on a number of other listening platforms. Wherever you listen to my podcast, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. These are free ways to support my work. Now, though, let's begin with our usual run-through of the literal and historical matters pertaining to chapters 30 and 31 of the book of Genesis. Jacob has struggled for 2 decades now. We learn this exact time frame when he mentions it later in chapter 31, verse 38. For 20 years he has worked Laban's flocks in exchange for at least his marriage to Laban's daughters, Rachel and Leah, and certainly he has had hopes for even more compensation after such a long time. So Jacob asks for more wages. Prior to our more formally capitalistic age, people didn't generally receive a wage on a bi-weekly basis, so a man might work for a season for his employer, say as a hired hand on a farm or a ranch. During his time of labor, he would receive room and board, and then, when the job was over, he would hopefully receive what he and the employer had agreed upon as a wage to be paid upon completion of the work. You can imagine this could be a little nerve-wracking for a laborer like Jacob, who has now worked 20 years for his uncle and has no idea, apparently, what he might receive in compensation for the entire labor of his youth. Would Laban pay him a fair amount? Would all his labor have been in vain? Would he have thrown away all this time and effort and walk away with nothing in poverty and still be responsible for the sustenance of not only his wives and their handmaids, but also his numerous children? When Laban simply asks Jacob what he would have in exchange for all these years of work, Jacob makes an interesting request. He wants only the speckled or spotted members of Laban's now abundant flocks, and the dark ones. He doesn't ask for the pure white ones, or any other solid color. More on that in the following allegorical segment of this episode. And then, as you can read for yourself, Laban engages in a bit of subterfuge. He removes all such spotted or speckled animals from his flocks and sends them far away with his sons. It seems an odd move because why would Laban want to impoverish or cheat the man who had married his daughters? Perhaps it is to keep Jacob from leaving because he is such a valuable worker, or maybe because Laban does not want his daughters to leave. Regardless of his motives, Laban is a very enigmatic figure in Scripture. because he is neither good nor bad, really. He is viewed favorably because he is, after all, close blood to Israel. He is Jacob's uncle. His daughters and their servants are literally the mothers of all Israelite tribes. So he is a grandfather to all of Israel just as much as Abraham or Isaac are. And yet Laban is dangerous. He is conniving. While he is your kin, he is also liable to cheat you. You must deal carefully with him. This is not really a story which describes a world of good and evil, black and white, like so many other biblical stories. Noah is clearly good, and his neighbors are wicked. Moses is clearly the good guy in Exodus, and Pharaoh the oppressor. The Philistines are clearly the bad guys in the cycle of David's stories later. But Laban is not some diabolical figure opposed to righteousness. Rather, Laban's wiliness is perhaps just something to be expected in all dealings with men. This is perhaps a reflection of the world that such men would inhabit. These guys are basically the businessmen of the ancient world, dealing in vital goods, such as the flesh, milk, and fur of their flocks. And every interaction with men like Jacob or Laban is a business interaction, a deal which must be hammered out, and in which both sides have an eye toward getting the best result, even if it results in some financial harm to their counterpart. Perhaps Laban serves as a caution for biblical readers in that sense, to understand that dealings in the world, no matter with whom, are always carried out on a difficult, even dangerous terrain. And this lesson is further reinforced when Jacob turns around and uses a little Hebrew desert magic to turn things to his advantage. While Laban is secretly removing any speckled or dark animals from his flocks, Jacob is taking all the animals, especially the strong ones, when they are in heat, and placing them in front of branches into which he has carved stripes and staked them into the ground. Now, this reflects some interesting ancient belief that animals in the process of reproduction would produce young that look like their surroundings. This folklore would make for a fascinating independent study topic, but we have neither the time nor the focus here to spare for this concept. Regardless, Scripture paints a morally complex picture here, in which both Laban and Jacob are a little bit devilish, to be honest. Neither one is exactly a portrait of righteousness like we might have imagined of Noah, let's say. It forces us to question if our own interpretation of what the Bible calls righteous is really in line with what the ancients would have called righteous. More on that in terms of morality later in the episode. Slowly then, Laban's flocks essentially become Jacob's as he increases the number of speckled and dark creatures among the flocks through his reproductive desert magic. Worse for Laban, these lambs and kids born into Jacob's portion are generally the strongest, healthiest members of the flocks. So Laban is left with the quote-unquote feeble ones, as the original Hebrew has it. At the beginning of chapter 31, we see that this upsets Laban's sons in particular. They are seeing their inheritance dwindle, and naturally Laban also is upset. Indeed, Jacob sees by his face that Laban is no longer friendly toward him. And here, with regard to this use of the word face, we should make note of another hidden theme that runs throughout Genesis, a theme of which most non-Hebrew readers are never even aware, even after a lifetime of reading the Bible. Now, this use of the word face in verse 2 of chapter 31, it may not even be in your translation at all. For instance, the New International Version paraphrases the Hebrew here into, "And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been." And yes, that meaning is intended here, but the Hebrew uses the word face in the actual text of the passage and uses it quite pointedly, and uses it several times throughout this passage, actually, though modern translations, like the New International Version, will completely ignore this and leave the word out entirely. If you want a better reflection of the original Hebrew in English here, you should consult the original King James Bible or the Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible. Both of them use the word countenance here with regard to the face. They say that Laban's countenance was not what it had been before, to indicate that his attitude toward Jacob had changed. And in verse 5, Jacob says to his wives, I see your father's countenance is not towards me as it had been before. The underlying Hebrew word here is the word for face, and it has been used repeatedly throughout the entire book of Genesis. Turn all the way back to chapter 1 now and look at verse 2. The face of the deep, it says, or perhaps the face of the ocean, or the face of the waters. But if you have a modern translation, it probably says something like surface instead. Now, there's nothing terribly wrong about such a translation. It is still getting the main idea across. But when you paraphrase the biblical text so heavily, weighting it toward modern idioms instead of respecting the original Hebrew, you miss a lot of meaning which the biblical writers intended for us to see. You see, this word face and many other words are used purposefully throughout the text. They are tattooed, you might say, all over the skin of the biblical text, making connections that many of us might miss by reading our modern paraphrased translations. For instance, the word for face first appears in chapter 1, verse 2, and then again in many places throughout, and in ways that actually impact the meaning of other passages. If you don't believe me, look at chapter 3, in which the fall occurs. Verse 8, the human and his wife hid themselves from the face of God. So face, along with many other particular words, is littered throughout the chapters of Genesis and not haphazardly. We'll get more into the significance of all this in the allegorical section of today's episode. Anyway, after Jacob sees this change in Laban's face, the Lord, YHWH, suddenly speaks to Jacob, and in the imperative. Verse 3, return to the land of your fathers. The Lord also sees the change in Laban's face and knows all too well what might happen if Laban and his sons work up the courage to do something about it. Jacob explains the need to depart to his wives, how their father has constantly mistreated him and disrespected his labor and tried to change his wages again and again, and he tells them about receiving a vision from quote-unquote God's messenger in a dream. Again, that earlier verse made it sound like God himself spoke directly to Jacob, as he did to Abraham, but this verse clarifies that it was actually God's messenger, his angel, and that it was all in a dream. Rachel and Leah make their own case for flight, that Laban has treated them as strangers and misused what is rightfully their inheritance as well. So they assert to their husband, do whatever God has said to you. And so they saddle up the entire household and set out. As verse 21 says, Jacob set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Laban catches up to Jacob, and a potentially tense but ultimately anticlimactic encounter follows. Laban accepts that Jacob had to leave, but why did he have to take Laban's gods with him? Now Jacob vows to kill whoever in his household has done such a thing, whoever has stolen Laban's gods. Now the word used here and earlier in the chapter when Rachel absconded with these quote-unquote gods, the Hebrew word used is teraphim. It does not actually mean gods, but that is the best translation that we can make today. Even Judaic scholars like Everett Fox admit that the meaning of the word is obscure, but that it probably refers to household idols, and the kind that every ancient household would have had, to which prayers and small sacrifices might have been directed. Almost every religion in the present and in the past had both public and private services. Public services at some sort of temple gathering, let's say, and then there were private rituals carried out in the home. That surely would have been the purpose of these idols or teraphim. They served as important items in what you might have called the house church. Rachel successfully hides these teraphim or idols under a camel's saddle and then sits down on all this, excusing herself from moving when her father comes to search her tent because she says she is on her period. Again, more on the meaning of this scene in the next segment. When the search comes up fruitless, Jacob is outraged. His uncle has ransacked his camp, and for what? Is this not the final insult in a 2-decade-long series of disrespectful acts? Laban finally backs down, though not before declaring that everything Jacob has, his flocks and his women and his children, all really belong to Laban. Nevertheless, He accepts the departure of Jacob and his daughters and his grandchildren, but he insists on quote-unquote cutting a covenant. Now this is, again, where we get the phrase in English, to cut a deal. Remember how Abraham made a covenant with the Lord in chapter 15, how he cut the animals in halves and God passed through them in the form of something like a smoking oven? He cut a covenant with God, and now Laban also wishes to cut a covenant with Jacob. So they build a mound of stones, like many other mounds that have been built throughout this book. This mound seems intended to serve as both a memorial of the deal and as a sort of frontier or border, something to keep the two parties from interfering with each other in the future. And here they eat a quote-unquote slaughter meal, as the Hebrew puts it, and they eat bread together before each goes his separate way. Laban back to his home in northern Mesopotamia, and Jacob to the Promised Land. Everett Fox tells us in the 5 books of Moses that the Hebrew here uses the repetition of specific words to point to major themes of the biblical text. Earlier, I mentioned how the word face appears many times throughout the text of Genesis. Now, you might initially want to dispel any significance in all this by simply pointing out that the word face is pretty mundane, pretty common, and that its repetition is not necessarily weighted with any particular meaning. But Hebrew poetry does use repetition quite pointedly. This will be borne out in the next episode when Jacob reaches his homeland again and encounters his brother Esau. In a single verse of the original Hebrew text, verse 21 of chapter 32, the original Hebrew uses the word face 4 times, and again 1 more time in the next verse. All this as something like a culmination of the increasing use of the word ever since the first verses of the whole book. The Gospel according to John does much the same thing, which is interesting because that Gospel, written in the most eloquent Greek of the entire New Testament really, and that Gospel according to John is often thought of as something written more for the sake of the Gentiles rather than the Hebrews. But its form is actually very Hebrew, especially with regard to its repetition. The original Greek of that gospel is very repetitious, using words like love, life, belief, truth, and other words again and again, to the point that when people translate the text, they feel the need to break it up a little because English readers are not typically very receptive to that sort of repetition. An initial reading of such texts, like Genesis and John, might cause an uneducated reader to think that the writer of the biblical text was not very sophisticated. Instead, the truth turns out to be that this is simply the Hebrew way of writing. It's their poetry, just like you might expect a 16th century English poem to rhyme or a 7th century Anglo-Saxon poem to use alliteration. You should expect an ancient Hebrew poem to use repetition. We will come back to this concept again in the next episode at that emotional scene in chapters 32 and 33 when Esau and Jacob are reunited, when they come face to face, so to speak, after 20 years of separation. This episode's passage contains a curious scene in which Rachel stars as the protagonist. Laban searches Jacob's camp for his quote-unquote gods, probably meaning his household idols, handcrafted images of whatever traditional deities the Israelites worshipped prior to the Lord. Rachel, not wanting to suffer the death penalty that Jacob pronounced for whoever was found to have taken Laban's gods, places the idols beneath a camel's saddle and then sits on them. Now, the text here obviously intends some sort of ridicule toward the idols. And this is a fitting start to a theme that will run throughout the rest of the Old Testament, particularly in the writings of the prophets. The idols, though Rachel treasured them enough to bring them with her, are mocked here by being placed beneath the saddle and sat upon by not just a woman, but a woman who claims to be experiencing her monthly menstruation. This may seem like shockingly crude humor for Scripture, but we will see this kind of thing again and again throughout the text. In St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, he mentions how his detractors insist on circumcising new Christians. And in this epistle, the frustrated apostle to the Gentiles wishes that these men would go all the way and castrate themselves. Scripture covers the whole gamut of writing: drama, tragedy, comedy, from delicate poetry to crude humor. As if to serve as an example of this continuum of scriptural gravity, this same passage then transitions to a reference to the Eucharist. At the very end of chapter 31, Laban and Jacob commemorate their accord next to the stone mound that they built. Verse 54 tells us that Jacob, quote, slaughtered a slaughter meal on the mountain and called his brothers to eat bread, unquote. That is a direct translation of the original Hebrew. Modern Protestant Bibles typically paraphrase this text here to avoid mention of the bread and to avoid mentioning the use of the term brothers used to describe Jacob's uncles and cousins. Again, for a better reflection of the original text, you should look to either the original King James or the Douay Rheims, in which specific reference to the sacrifice and the eating of bread is retained. It should not surprise any of us that a sacrifice was involved because we naturally associate animal sacrifice with ancient religious practices. By now, however, I do not need to dwell at length on how these verses serve as another example of typology, a foreshadowing of things to come in the New Testament, where there will be the ultimate sacrifice, that of Christ, of God Himself, and the sharing of bread in commemoration of His death and resurrection. This passage, in terms of moral analysis, is a bit tricky. Looking back so far through Scripture, the moral messages have always been quite clear, even if they are sometimes opposed to more modern takes on morality. Until now, though, the Bible has certainly seemed to preserve its own internal logic. Righteous characters follow God, avoid immorality, and so on. Now, when we think of biblical morality, we probably bring a lot of our own baggage to the table. We probably think that being honest and not lying are part of what the Bible asks us to do, of what God expects of us, that these things are components of righteousness. As I said in an earlier segment, we must consider whether we are wrong about what the Bible considers righteous. If we are inserting into the biblical text a lot of modern cultural ideas about what it means to be quote-unquote good, rather than listening to what Scripture is actually telling us. But if you skip ahead to the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and you reread them now, you might find that some things are missing that you perhaps considered were always there. For instance, the commandments don't mention lying. Now, yes, one of the commandments is, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor, and a lot of people equate that with lying. But that commandment is actually very specific when compared to other commandments. For instance, the commandments don't say, thou shalt not murder such and such a person, or thou shalt not steal from such and such a person. They just say, don't murder, don't steal. But here, in the 8th or 9th commandment, Protestants and Catholics number them differently, the commandments say, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, even if we broaden the definition of neighbor, and that doesn't really happen until Jesus comes, but even if we do that, this still doesn't equate to, quote unquote, don't lie. Rather, this commandment is discouraging people from lying in certain types of situations, such as in a court hearing or any other kind of situation in which judgment might be passed, where they might try to say someone did something that they didn't do. The Bible isn't saying that you can never lie. This may shock some people, but it's true. And now, I'm not saying that the Bible encourages lying either. The Bible is simply saying that you should not lie to hurt other people, or at least not your neighbor. It is not excluding the need to lie in order to save yourself. We will come back to this in Exodus, when God and Moses are clearly lying to Pharaoh about Israel's plans should Pharaoh grant the request, and they are released to go worship God in the desert. They are not doing this to hurt the Pharaoh, but rather to save the people of Israel. My point here is that we may be a little upset by the behavior of Jacob and Laban in this passage, not because they are in the wrong, but because we have failed to really read the Bible and instead we bring a modern filter to it. We have this idea that quote unquote dishonesty is always evil, that we should be honest even when it is to our own disadvantage. And the simple fact is that such a message is not found here, not in the Old Testament anyway, nor is it even considered. Be wise as serpents, Christ tells us in the 10th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew. Be wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Unpacking that dense statement is truly some heavy theological work. Now, simultaneously, Laban's actions are probably taken as problematic, sure, but he's not evil in this situation. He is, as I mentioned before, just kind of wily. He skirts on the edge of immorality rather than step boldly across the line separating good and evil. And so does Jacob. Someone with a more saintly take on morality, let's say, might have said that Jacob should just let Laban do whatever he wants to him. Let him destroy his future by removing such animals that might have come out as Jacob's wages, or that Jacob should be ashamed of himself for using his magical trickery to alter the makeup of Laban's herds in order to enrich himself. But like I said, that is a morality that we bring to the Bible from our own perspective. The Hebrews of ancient times, who had to live through scenarios like these, certainly felt justified in playing fast and loose with the parameters of honesty because really, it was a matter of survival. If Jacob had just let Laban abuse him, his family and his faith would have died out. Which might sound like I am endorsing an ends justifies the means morality, but I'm not. It's just that the permitted means used to achieve those ends are perhaps different than what we might think. Laban and Jacob are certainly neighbors in the biblical sense. They call each other brother, after all. But there is perhaps more leeway to how they are permitted to treat each other and still remain quote-unquote righteous. There is another threatening scene here toward the end of this passage, though, which will definitely be revisited in future books of the Bible. Here, Jacob swears a vow, and I don't think Moses himself would disagree with me here that it is an unwise, even an immoral vow. Jacob swears that whoever is found with Laban's idols will be killed on the spot. Now, Rachel avoids tragedy here in ultimately a comical way, but in the future, after the Hebrews have returned from Egypt and conquered the Promised Land, a man named Jephthah will make a similar vow about killing someone, and the story there will end in horrible sorrow. And now, as we drift toward the ending of the episode, we turn as usual to the significance of the story in terms of the end of time, the end times. How do we interpret this story eschatologically? What does it tell us about our destiny, about God's plan for us, about God's endgame? This whole passage begins with a yearning that should be easily recognizable, the desire to return home. Jacob's wish to return home has its own very real-world motivations, certainly, but it is also another moment of typology for the Christian, an Old Testament foreshadowing of the great movement of the New Testament, the shift away from the so-called real world, that is, human society with all its imaginary needs and expectations, and a shifting toward the truly real world, the kingdom of heaven, our home, to which the Christian desires to return more than anything. And it also seems significant that Jacob, when asked to request what he wants in terms of wages, what he wants in return for all his laboring in human society, he does not ask for the best of the herds. He pointedly wants the quote-unquote speckled ones and the dark ones. He does not want the pure white animals. He does not want the perfect-looking ones. It is not too hard, perhaps, to see also in this a foreshadow of Christ's own mission to the people of earth. Those who are well are in no need of a physician, says Christ in the gospel. I have come not to call the righteous, but rather the sinners. And just so, Jacob will bring back with him flocks of speckled sheep and goats, come back to the promised land with the imperfect, with herds of spotted outcasts. In the next episode, we will come to chapters 32 through 36 of Genesis, in which Jacob is reunited with Esau, his brother, And we will read about all the events that happen after his family settles one more time in the Promised Land. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.